Bay, along the Mall, and as you were saying, Adam, through Horse Guards, through the arch and down to the Sovereign's entrance.
And Alistair, I remember, in an exclusive, you talked to Her Majesty about the crown jewels. I mean, obviously they're symbolic, but what do they really mean to her?
Well, I remember her being very amusing about actually wearing a crown and how you have to lift the speech up to your face rather than tilt your head forward to read the speech. And she said otherwise she'd either break her neck or it would fall off. And I think that because it's 2.5 pounds in weight, it's made with 2 or more thousand diamonds. It's got other great stones, which when we get a chance to look at it, I'll take us through, because literally it is an object that contains objects from the whole of our history, going back to Saxon times. But it is not an easy thing to wear.
Just going...
In fact, the Queen won't be wearing it today. It'll be carried for her by the Lord Great Chamberlain. And I suspect that even when she was in her robes the last time she had it carried also, she has probably taken the view that this is not a headdress that she will comfortably wear again in her mid-90s.
Just going under the arch there at Horse Guards Parade. And she's going to be accompanied, we understand, by her son, the heir to the throne.
Yes, the Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall will come from Clarence House a little later on. They will meet the Queen at the Palace of Westminster, but they will arrive slightly ahead of her. And then she will be escorted with them present down to the chamber itself.
It's good to see some horses in Horse Guards Parade, very popular with tourists, but the normal horse boxes on Whitehall have been shut during the pandemic, but I see they've been opened up again today.
It's turning out the guard, and in fact Queen Victoria passed through there once and the Queen's lifeguard had forgotten, and so she insisted that for 100 years they would turn out every day at 4 o'clock. In fact, they still do it because the tradition was seen to be rather a joyous one, and the tourists have enjoyed it, obviously before COVID. But now on to Whitehall and all the principal offices of the Secretaries of State to the Queen. And the crown, I suppose, because it does represent the power in the land. For instance, every time you get your income tax return, it's got a crown represented on it. It appears on our currency. It appears on police officers' helmets and also on our post boxes. So it's ubiquitous in Britain, and it contains a great deal of our history, but it is a symbol of the power that actually is vested in the people of the United Kingdom, who choose the Parliament that is sovereign.
And just a reminder, this is the Crown arriving at Parliament for the state opening. Her Majesty the Queen not in this particular motorcade. She'll be coming in one later. And does it work, Alistair, that they wait for the Crown to arrive before the monarch leaves Buckingham Palace?
Well, they took that.
Well, not quite. They'll make sure that the Queen arrives at the precise time that has been scheduled, and that probably has been timed, because they do this at Buckingham Palace. They check the timings of everything. And you can see at the base of the Victoria Tower the massive arch that was deliberately designed to be this formal entrance of the third part of the Constitution, the Crown, which is in itself, by authority, the first. But the two that are always here, the Lords and Commons, and when the monarch arrives, she comes in, as she will after the Crown later on. And literally just inside that arch, there is an entrance to the great sovereign staircase, and the Crown will be taken up there to the robing room, ready for when the Queen arrives later on.
And we understand now that the Queen doesn't use the stairs, she uses a lift. Is that right?
Well, I think it's much easier, and she's done that for a few years now, very quietly, and there is a lift that brings you out literally on the principal corridor right beside the entrance to the robing room, so very easily she can get in and be prepared. But as I say, she's wearing a day dress today. We don't yet know precisely what she's going to wear, but it'll be just a comfortable outfit. She tends to make a decision on the day, depending on the weather. And I don't know what it's like in London necessarily, but it's been a bit changeable.
Yeah, a little bit cloudy. It looked like a sort of superhero movie behind Ian King earlier on with the sky, but it's clear it's not raining yet. Alistair, for now, thank you very much indeed. We await Her Majesty's journey to Buckingham Palace. With me is our political editor, Beth Rigby. I mean, Beth, one of the games always played with Queen's speeches is just how busy MPs are going to be, how many bills there are, and, you know, what's likely to run into trouble with MPs. Any ideas?
Well, there's 25 bills, I think, but don't hold me to that, but about a couple of dozen, let's put it that way. And then in terms of what might agitate MPs, well, as I was saying earlier, I think in terms of constitutional issues or electoral issues, certainly the voter ID bill is a huge issue. There have been suggestions that 3.5 million of lower income voters and people across the country just simply don't have photo ID. They don't have a passport.
Oh, well, we already had David Davis making a noise about it.
Yeah, so that will be very controversial. In fact, Labour's Shadow Justice Secretary David Lammy has criticised these plans. And he said, you know, in the 2019 election, there was just one conviction for voter fraud. 3.5 million British citizens do not have photo ID. So I think that will be very controversial. It might not be hugely controversial on the Tory benches, but it will be definitely a big talking point. And then, of course, social care. I mean, this was the promise 22 months ago to bring forward a comprehensive plan for social care. What do we know? Well, we expect that there will be proposals brought forward. Will there actually be a bill? There will be a health and care bill, but that might be more about integrating health and social care rather than actually reforming the social care system. And already before the Queen has even made her speech, before MPs are even in the chambers, Damien Green, the former Deputy Prime Minister, saying this morning, I'm frustrated it's taken so long to get to this stage. This needs to be the year for action and decision rather than kicking the can down the road. But as I understand it, I'm not expecting an actual bill on social care. And that really is a huge challenge for Boris Johnson's government, how to reform social care. Theresa May had a go at it, didn't she, in 2017, and it became...
That went well.
Well, I was going to say it became the Achilles heel of her general election, then it was kicked into the long grass. This has been discussed for a decade now, how to fix it, and I think MPs will be disappointed if a bill is not brought forward. Proposals and a bill are different things.
And the other question, of course, is going to be which ministers will be bringing forward which bills. We've had this mini shake-up in the shadow team. What about the real cabinet? Can we expect that there will be changes in the cabinet soon, a reshuffle?
Well, earlier this year, government figures suggested to me that the Prime Minister would do a reshuffle towards the end of the parliamentary term, so that would be into the summer, so June into July. And there has been talk about it, but in terms of where they are right now, they've just had this thumping victory in the elections. I do think that there is a sense within government that there are some posts where they perhaps need more muscular cabinet ministers. There has been some criticism that some of the biggest and best talent is actually outside the cabinet, not inside the cabinet. We know also, though, that Boris Johnson likes to be the undisputed leader rather than perhaps the first among equals.
I mean, someone was saying to me last night, it's quite interesting that, you know, we haven't heard much from Jacob Rees-Mogg, for example. Seems to have been very firmly put back in his box after being quite prominent.
Well, Jacob Rees-Mogg was very supportive of the Prime Minister in his bid to become leader. He was one of the MPs, one of the senior MPs in the ERG, the Brexit skeptic, the Eurosceptic group, sorry, that backed Boris Johnson. He was awarded with that leader of the Commons position. But there have been a couple of issues where he creates headlines where they don't really like it. But he seems secure in that post.
Let's go over to Alistair Bruce for more ceremonial. Alistair, I think this is the motorcade of the Prince of Wales, who, of course, given Her Majesty's age, is becoming more and more prominent in public life.
Well, the Prince of Wales has become the patriarch of the family following the death of his father, the Duke of Edinburgh. And he has for some time been supporting the Queen at significant events, and he has already supported her at previous state openings of Parliament. So this is entirely in line. He's coming with the Duchess of Cornwall, and they will be sat to the Queen's left as she reads the speech from the throne, and in a place really that was established when they created the House of Lords, and that great golden canopy over the throne, a place for Queen Victoria's son, Albert Edward, then Prince of Wales, who became Edward VII. But for the Prince of Wales coming to Parliament, you're right, it is clear that there will be a greater degree of expectation upon him to support the Queen in her role as head of state.
Truly fantastic aerial shots, I have to say, showing Horse Guards very much to an advantage. It's a privilege, isn't it, of Privy Councillors, Alistair, that they can take their cars through the arch, is that right?
Yes, certain people had what was called the ivory pass. And if you held an ivory pass, particularly in the old days, it used to be Secretaries of State and therefore rightly Privy Councillors, they could show it at the form of security that existed back in the Edwardian period, and the ivory pass let you through. But it used to be, Horse Guards, the principal entrance to Whitehall Palace, and that's why it is still given the principal regiment of the army, the Household Cavalry Regiment, to act as the guards there, which seems such a long way away from where the Queen actually lives at Buckingham Palace. But we always remember these traditions, the Prince of Wales passing the cenotaph there, therefore very close now on Parliament Street to coming to the Palace of Westminster itself. And they're all very good roads, are they not, for ceremonial routes, especially when there's nobody on them.
Yeah, well, they've been specially designed, haven't they, with removable street furniture. So there's no traffic lights or bollards or all the usual stuff we get in streets to hold people up. Although, of course, these days, with worries about the crowds, there are a lot of temporary barriers put up, as we're seeing there. In fact, again, I think more temporary barriers this year than we've ever seen before. And, of course, you know, we are seeing from these pictures the state of disrepair that the Palace of Westminster is in, with scaffolding and tarpaulins in many areas, including, of course, on the symbolic Big Ben. And Beth, I think it's fair to say they still haven't quite resolved how they're going to renovate the House of Commons and what's going.
No, and I was just looking at those pictures thinking, isn't it a shame? And when you go inside as well, and you'll know this, it really is quite dilapidated inside as well. I mean, it really does.
There are almost buckets in the corridors.
Yeah, it needs more than a makeover, doesn't it? It needs a complete kind of gutting, really. But yes, there are still debates ongoing about when does Parliament... when is it evacuated, if you like?
Yeah, there's Big Ben.
And I know, and, you know... restored, should the Commons move to the Lords, should the Lords move out to buildings in the vicinity, and it hasn't been resolved, actually. It's still under debate.
Yeah. But I think they have, MPs decided they're not going to move their Commons chamber out of London, although there's some...
No, there was some discussions about whether they move it to another part of the country, but I think that won't happen. The obvious thing to do would be to move it to another part of the government estate around Westminster. But again, lots of MPs are very reluctant to leave the chambers because once they move out, I mean, I can't remember how long it is, but it is many years. It's not just a quick, you know...
Yeah.
Home improvement show, yeah. And you're back in. I mean, it will take years. It will take years for it to happen. So it would be a big, moment to move MPs out for an indefinite period of time.
Of course, some questions about the future of Buckingham Palace itself. Not that the building won't stay there, of course it will. But I think the monarch actually offered it as a temporary base for Parliament if they needed one in Westminster. That wasn't an idea that didn't fly, but some suggestions that perhaps when there is a change of monarch, that the new monarch might decide not to reside in Buckingham Palace, and it may become more of a sort of public building. It'll be interesting. See, that happens. We're waiting for Her Majesty the Queen to leave to come to the Palace of Westminster for her speech opening Parliament, the gracious speech, as they refer to it. She's due to be delivering that speech in a little over 15 minutes. So I think things will move forward fairly quickly from this point. Also interesting, isn't it, sometimes, Beth, how the government who write the Queen's speech, they literally put the words in her mouth. And sometimes they get a bit cheeky and put their own slogans in. I remember New Labour put tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime in Her Majesty's mouth.
Exactly. It will be very interesting to see if any Boris Johnson slogans find their way into Her Majesty's speech, and whether they will, use Build Back Better or Levelling Up with those words coming from the Queen's mouth. We'll find out soon enough.
The other thing we often get announcements of in the Queen's speech is any visits she's going to make, or any state visits, but I suppose in this time of COVID, that's less likely.
No, and so she would make an announcement, but it's less likely. We saw, didn't we, in terms of just foreign visits, the Prime Minister himself having to cancel that trip to India in January. He was meant to go. It was postponed because of our lockdown, and then he was meant to go again in April, and that was postponed because of India's terrible COVID crisis.
And then the G7 foreign ministers, which was an in-person meeting, didn't go so well.
No, there were two cases of COVID found there. In June, though, the world is coming to the UK and to Cornwall, where we are going to host the G7 summit, and I think the US President will be here. So there will be a big international event, and it will be on our shores. We won't have to go anywhere.
Oh, lots of fresh air in Cornwall, so
I'm not complaining.
So that will blow the virus away, I'm sure. Lords waiting. I think I'm right in saying that they had a ballot as to who could sit in the chamber.
Yeah, because typically you'd expect 600 people to be around for this event. I think there's about 100, so there's only a limited number of Lords allowed in the chamber, so it'd be a much more subdued affair than it normally is, but maybe the next one around will be back to normal.
And a new Lord Speaker, John McFall from Labour, taking over from Norman Fowler, so he'll be involved in the ceremony at some point, but I think the key person is the Lord Chancellor, isn't it? And there's the senior representative of the government. MPs too, I imagine, are limited in their number.
Yeah, limited numbers in the chamber as well, although it will be the first time we see Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer face to face after that election drubbing for Starmer and victory for the Prime Minister.
Well, let's go over to Alistair Bruce now for, I think, Her Majesty's motorcade going to make its way to Westminster. Alistair.
The Queen coming out of the garden gate, saluted by the guard at Buckingham Palace and taken in a Range Rover today with her lady-in-waiting, who is the Lady Elizabeth Leeming, and they're followed by her private secretary, who is Sir Edward Young, and also the Queen's aquarium-waiting Major Tom White. Quite interesting that the Mall, which always looks such a perfect processional route for Buckingham Palace, was in fact there before the palace was built. It was a place that people went to promenade and to play a game called Pelle Melle, and so the Mall word comes from that. And yet it was turned in Edward VII's reign into this fabulous, slightly red-tinted processional route, and it's been perfectly suited to taking monarchs to Parliament. This is the 67th occasion during the Queen's reign that she has opened a Parliament. And as you were discussing earlier on, the Queen opens Parliaments at the beginning of the Parliament itself, which is generally 5 years, or at the start of each session during that 5 years. So the Queen will be supported when she arrives at the Palace of Westminster by her son and daughter-in-law. But of course, before she left, she was assured that there was a hostage waiting in the palace for her safe return. On this occasion, Mr. Marcus Jones MP, who is the Vice Chamberlain of the household, he arrived at the palace earlier today, was met by the Lord Chamberlain, and he gets to sit down and I hope watch Sky News and see what happens, because as long as the Queen returns safely, he is then released and allowed to go back to Parliament for the debates this afternoon. It was on this very spot where the Queen is passing that she was shot at by someone with a fake pistol back in the early 1980s, an occasion that reminded us that public life can sometimes carry its dangers.
Alistair, I was going to say that the Queen travelling in a Range Rover, I mean, that is very much dressed down, isn't it? We had much smarter limousines, Rolls-Royce for the Crown, and I think for Prince Charles it was a Daimler or something. This is a sort of down-to-earth statement, although, of course, Range Rovers are quite posh cars.
I think the Queen has always had a very practical view on things, and receiving the salute there from the Queen's Lifeguard, for her, this is an occasion where there isn't the pageantry, there isn't the troops lining the routes, apart from the Lifeguard there, and of course the Buckingham Palace Guard, which have been turned out. And therefore, there is no point in doing things up in some way that's not necessary. And the Queen doesn't tend to want any more fuss about herself than is necessary for the job that's being done. So for her, this is a practical transfer from the palace to the Palace of Westminster. And of course, it will give her the chance to be very quickly swept back afterwards for a good lunch.
And the Queen, I think it's her 67th speech she's actually delivered herself, is that right?
That's correct. And there have been occasions when she's missed it. She was unable to attend when she was expecting the birth of Prince Andrew and Prince Edward in 1959 and 1963. And there was no state opening at all in 2011, 2018 and 2020. And the Speaker's procession now making its way into the House of Commons for prayers. And a reminder that all of this is carefully brought together in that way that Britain does rather well, and choreographed to the last second. And after prayers, the Commons will be ready to receive the Sovereign's command from Black Rod in order to attend upon Her Majesty immediately in the House of Peers.
Speaker taking his chair, the mace being put in place.
Speaker at prayers. Speaker at prayers.
Ironically, it's because the Queen is returning to Parliament that the mace, which is a symbol of her authority, is released again to be used and to make the sittings formal in both the Lords and the Commons, although the Lords received their mace after the Queen has left. There is the canopy above the Queen's throne, and beside it on the right, the table on which the imperial state crown, the symbol of the monarchy, will be placed. And you can see the chairs to the right, where the Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall will sit. On either side of the Queen will be carried the cap of maintenance and the sword of state. The Lord Chief Justice on what are called the woolsacks, a reminder from the Middle Ages that the wealth of England was derived from the wool from the sheep. The Bishop of London on the Bishop's bench. They're the only people in the House of Lords to have a little arm at the end of their bench in order to keep them propped up and comfortable. Interestingly, all the robes that they're wearing have provenance going way back to the Middle Ages again. The robe worn by most peers is divided down the centre. On the right-hand side, you have a number of bars of gold and ermine according to the rank in the peerage that they hold, 2 meaning baron. And on the left-hand side, there is an open arm, which reminds us of the spiritual side of the makeup of the House of Lords. So spiritual and temporal, temporal being the land, spiritual being of God and everything else. So these robes have, again, been seen in all the illustrations of the House of Lords and can be seen being worn back in the Tudor period. So I can tell you that those are 2 barons, a baroness and a baron. And you can just tell, because if you're a duke, you have 4 rows of gold and ermine, 2 for a baron, 2.5 for a viscount, 3 for an earl, 3.5 for a marquis. So everything carefully regulated, and I'm sure nobody much cares to know all that detail. But it does show that there's nothing done in any of the ritual and ceremony that we see in the United Kingdom that doesn't have a provenance or reason. And in a way, discovering all of that can be quite interesting.
And the most senior member of the peerage, they actually get a role in this ceremony, is that right?
Well, the dukes, if they're here, do indeed. Of course, the most senior person after the monarch is the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is not present today, it would seem. But bishops are still under certain restrictions, and with precedence given to new women bishops over men, given permission and a right to sit in the House of Lords under the current makeup. But the principal rank of the peerage is duke, and they're like princes, really, and were always, in the old days, if a duke stood, everyone would shout in the House of Lords, Duke, 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 and whoever was speaking had to shut up and listen to what the duke had to say. But those days are long behind us.
One bit of ceremonial I noticed, Alistair, they did go through with was the Beefeaters searching Parliament.
Well, no one forgets 1605, and although the Fixed Term Parliament Act puts the opening of Parliament in May, it generally was in November time, and that is why we have the gunpowder plot marked in November as it took place in 1605. And had the plan been successful, it would have exploded the king and all his government and all Parliament, and it would have achieved the aims of those who were seeking to put that challenge in the way of fate. But still, you're right, Adam, they check every state opening day. I can hear the trumpets. That is the sovereign salute, which means the Queen is leaving the royal robing room and making her way through the royal gallery, the Prince's chamber, and she will shortly be coming into the chamber. And as her procession does, the lordships will stand, and Her Majesty the Queen will go to the throne. When she is in position, her procession has settled, and the Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall are in place, she'll say, "My lords, pray be seated," and they will then sit down. She will then wait a few moments, and she will then give a signal to the Lord Great Chamberlain, who is the Marquis of Cholmondeley, who will then in turn raise a white wand to send the message to Black Rod, who's waiting in the central lobby, to summon, on the Queen's instructions, the Commons to the bar of the Lords. And we will have the privilege of seeing that most important part of our Constitution, that the door of the Commons is slammed in the face of the Queen's messenger, to remind Her Majesty, who's looking at this moment from that throne, straight down the corridor, that she has no place in the House of Commons. Here comes the Queen's procession into the House of Lords.
If I say more, it's because I've underestimated.
My Lords, pray be seated.
The Imperial State Crown will be placed beside Her Majesty the Queen. And in order to meet with COVID instructions, the Queen's instructions are now being given to the Lord Great Chamberlain, and he has waved his white wand, and the message is now passed to summon the Commons to the Lords. And there's always a sort of wait while this takes place in the House of Lords. Black Rod, an appointment coming from the time of Edward III. The door slammed in the Queen's authority.
It's Black Rod. Open the door. Black Rod!
She will proceed and will bow to the Speaker and to both sides of the House and then deliver the message.
Mr. Speaker, the Queen commands this House of Peers.
And Adam, very much as you said, we'll now see a reduced number making their way to the bar in the House of Commons. But the mace, the symbol of the Queen's authority in the Commons, that with it present the exercising of the powers of the chamber can be exercised. And now very carefully those who need to make their way to the Lords, going in observance of the rules we all live by today.
Well, social distancing between politicians, preventing the need of any of those awkward conversations between opponents we sometimes see. Boris Johnson striding ahead of Sir Keir Starmer and everyone else following in single file.
Adam, on those occasions when my other roles have had me waiting in the House of Lords for the arrival of the Commons, it's very interesting. You hear this sort of river of noise as the members of the House of Commons exercising their right to have a jolly good chat on the way up come in, and they continue this conversation. That roar goes on at this point. A bow to Her Majesty the Queen from Speaker and Black Rod, and chaplains come in and the Chief Clerk, and you'll notice, as discussed earlier, the care with which everyone is placed. And then the Earl Marshal, the Duke of Norfolk, doesn't have to give the signal this time to the Lord Chancellor in the same way, because the speech is already for Her Majesty at her fingertips. The Queen's speech.
My Lords and members of the House of Commons, my government's priority is to deliver a national recovery from the pandemic that makes the United Kingdom stronger, healthier and more prosperous than before. To achieve this, my government will level up opportunities across all parts of the United Kingdom supporting jobs, businesses and economic growth, and addressing the impact of the pandemic on public services. My government will protect the health of the nation, continuing the vaccination programme and providing additional funding to support the NHS. My ministers will bring forward legislation to empower the NHS to innovate and embrace technology. Patients will receive more tailored and preventative care closer to home. Measures will be brought forward to support the health and well-being of the nation, including to tackle obesity and improve mental health. Proposals on social care reform will be brought forward. My government will build on the success of the vaccination programme to lead the world in life sciences, pioneering new treatments against diseases like cancer and securing jobs and investment across the country. My ministers will oversee the fastest ever increase in public funding for research and development and pass legislation to establish an advanced research agency. Following the unprecedented support provided to businesses during the pandemic, proposals will be brought forward to create and support jobs and improve regulation. My government will strengthen the economic ties across the Union, investing in and improving national infrastructure. Proposals will be taken forward to transform connectivity by rail and bus and to extend 5G mobile coverage and gigabit-capable broadband. Legislation will support a lifetime skills guarantee to enable flexible access to high-quality education and training throughout people's lives. Measures will be introduced to ensure that support for businesses reflects the United Kingdom's strategic interests and drives economic growth. Laws will simplify procurement in the public sector. 8 new free ports will create hubs for trade and help regenerate communities. My government will ensure that the public finances are returned to a sustainable path once the economic recovery is secure. Measures will be brought forward to ensure that children have the best start in life, prioritising their early years. My ministers will address lost learning during the pandemic and ensure every child has a high-quality education and is able to fulfil their potential. My government will help more people to own their own home while enhancing the rights of those who rent. Laws to modernise the planning system so that more homes can be built will be brought forward, along with measures to end the practice of ground rents for new leasehold properties. My ministers will establish in law a new building safety regulator to ensure that the tragedies of the past are never repeated. Measures will be brought forward to address racial and ethnic disparities and ban conversion therapy. Legislation will support the voluntary sector by reducing unnecessary bureaucracy and releasing additional funds for good causes. My government will invest in new green industries to create jobs while protecting the environment. The United Kingdom is committed to achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 and will continue to lead the way internationally by hosting the COP26 summit in Glasgow. Legislation will set binding environmental targets. Legislation will also be brought forward to ensure the United Kingdom has and promotes the highest standards of animal welfare. My government will strengthen and renew democracy and the Constitution. Legislation will be introduced to ensure the integrity of elections, protect freedom of speech, and restore the balance of power between the executive, legislature, and the courts. My ministers will promote the strength and integrity of the Union. Measures will be brought forward to strengthen devolved government in Northern Ireland and address the legacy of the past. My government will introduce measures to increase the safety and security of its citizens. Legislation will increase sentences for the most serious and violent offenders and ensure the timely administration of justice. Proposals will be brought forward to address violence, including against women and girls, and to support victims. Measures will be brought forward to establish a fairer immigration system that strengthens the United Kingdom's borders and deters criminals who facilitate dangerous and illegal journeys. My government will lead the way in ensuring internet safety for all, especially for children, whilst harnessing the benefits of a free, open and secure internet. My ministers will provide our gallant armed services with the biggest spending increase in 30 years, taking forward their programme of modernisation and reinforcing the United Kingdom's commitment to NATO. My ministers will honour and strengthen the Armed Forces Covenant, placing it in law. Measures will be introduced to provide national insurance contribution relief for employers of veterans. Legislation will be introduced to counter hostile activity by foreign states. My ministers will implement the integrated review of security, defence, development and foreign policy. The United Kingdom will host the G7 summit and lead the global effort to secure a robust economic recovery from the pandemic. My ministers will deepen trade ties in the Gulf, Africa, and the Indo-Pacific. My government will continue to provide aid where it has the greatest impact on reducing poverty and alleviating human suffering. My government will uphold human rights and democracy across the world. It will take forward a global effort to get 40 million girls across the world into school. Members of the House of Commons, estimates for the public services will be laid before you. My Lords and members of the House of Commons, other measures will be laid before you. I pray that the blessing of Almighty God may rest upon your councils.
The Lord Chancellor approaches the Queen. He doesn't come to receive the speech back, but ceremony is observed. And with that, the crown is picked up and Her Majesty the Queen, when she's ready, will stand, and also the Lords with her. The Queen will signify her goodbye by looking to the different sides of the House of Lords, saying goodbye with a bow. And then the Sovereign leaves the House of Lords. And the power vested in the Sovereign but carried by Parliament is now, as it were, released into the debating that follows with the bills that must be looked at and have been listed. And the Queen will return to Buckingham Palace, and the peers will go to remove their parliamentary robes, and the chamber will be prepared for its debate this afternoon. And effectively, a tradition that takes us back to the very beginnings of royal power as it was brought into question and challenged by others has been played out before us. We saw the appearance of power in the Queen, and we see the reality of power here with very much less splendour and glamour. But these are the representatives of the people who must now do their debate. And that great building that was built for these moments now goes to its real purpose, debate.
Sitting suspended until 2:30 p.m.
Sitting suspended till 2:30 p.m.
Well, MPs will be back this afternoon to start debating the Queen's speech. That debate normally takes about a week. By tradition, it opens with two backbenchers making speeches before the Prime Minister replies to them. Given Boris Johnson's love of oratory, that will probably be a fairly amusing start to what is going to be, clearly from what we've heard in the Queen's speech, a very serious process of government. Something around 25 bills announced, centring, of course, first of all, the government on getting past the COVID pandemic, getting the economy running again, a pledge in that speech to balance the books, and then legislation concentrating on the health service, social care, jobs, and also quite a lot of constitutional reform. Well, with me is our political editor, Beth Rigby. What are the main things you think we should take away from that agenda for government?
Well, I think the first thing to say was that there was a bit of sloganeering there, wasn't there, when the Queen talked about levelling up the country. So the Prime Minister did get some sloganeering in there from Her Majesty. But look, in terms of the actual substance there, you clearly have, on the constitutional issues, quite a clear intent from the government. In that speech, it said legislation will be introduced to ensure the integrity of elections, protect freedom of speech and restore the balance of power between the executive, legislature and the courts. Now, many people would argue that the balance of power works quite well, thank you, as it is. But obviously Boris Johnson has a big majority. They did not like what happened over the prorogation of Parliament, and that being overruled by the Supreme Court. So I think that that is something to watch and see what happens as that legislation gets laid. What do they actually intend to do? Again, on the issue of voter ID, the integrity of elections, I think that that will be a big deal. Voter ID requirement, these are figures from the Electoral Commission in 2015. They thought approximately 3.5 million electors, 7.5 of the electorate would have none of the forms of the ID highlighted. So is this quite a sledgehammer to crack a nut, in that there was only a few cases of in-person voter fraud in the 2019 election, and cynics and the opposition would argue that this is a way of the Conservative Party to kind of cut some people out of elections, because it tends to be people with lower economic status are less likely to have driver's licence and passports. So I think that that will be a big bone of contention. And of course, in terms of the government's agenda, the big push here, obviously, on skills, trying to level up the country by giving adults more and better access to education. That was the big government flagship policy in here. And then, of course, Adam, the NHS and health, a huge backlog of operations from the COVID pandemic, building back how they're going to do that. And on social care, as I said earlier, nothing concrete in there.
Well, it's just interesting, social care. I'm just looking, we are given, once the speech has been delivered, some background briefing, and this is the government document on that, and what it says about social care, which, as you say, very vague. Social care reform will be brought forward. That's all the Queen says. It said the government is committed to improving the adult social care system and will bring forward proposals in 2021. The bill will include provisions to improve the oversight of how social care is commissioned and delivered, facilitate greater integration between the health and care services by placing an integrated care system on a statutory footing. It will collect better data. And what we're really seeing is the government committing to further integration of the health and the care system, and just ends pointing out the need for the situation to improve in social care, that 1.5 million people work there, care costs are unpredictable, and also the point being made that social care is not just for the elderly. There are many people who, for reasons of disability, need social care in the general population as well.
And that's it, Adam. I mean, the issue is it's not just about integrating NHS services with social care. It's how do you fund long-term social care for an ageing population. Japan and Germany, they have different systems where people pay in. I mean, Japan, obviously, where people really do have longevity into old age. They get over 40s to pay a certain amount into the system. Here we have a system where you have to start funding, but should we cap that so people don't lose their entire life savings into social care? That is something that's been reported the Prime Minister is keen on, but it's expensive. What do the Treasury say? I don't need to tell you about the economic fallout of the pandemic and the extremely high levels of debt the government are facing. Now, we can obviously run a big debt burden, but, you know, if you want to be fiscally responsible, how is the government going to pay for everything?
A lot of people are saying that. I mean, that was written in, that they are going to balance the books again, or try and
in terms of day-to-day spending. So if you have a big social care funding package as well, that's something on top of everything else. And this is what, as I was saying earlier, this is what Damien Green told Sky News this morning, the former Deputy Prime Minister. He said that people agreed more money was needed, and the political issue is where will that cash come from? And he said to Sky News this morning, the root of all of this is we all agree you have to spend more money on social care. We've got a threadbare system now. Where that money comes from is why it's proved so politically difficult over the decades. And it looks today that the government, again, is kicking it into the medium term. No bill, more proposals. I mean, it was promised 22 months ago. People have been asking for this. When was the deal not review? He was asked to look into social care. It was a decade ago, wasn't it? 2011.
Indeed. Well, let's get some thoughts on Her Majesty, who looked in fine form delivering that speech in her dress-down gear. Alistair, a strong performance, it has to be said, by Her Majesty.
Oh, definitely. And for her, this is very much what she must do. It's her duty to do what a sovereign must, and that is to mark the moment at the start of the session by opening Parliament. Not all monarchs did it in the old days, but the Queen has pretty persistently made sure that she always does it when she can. And yes, the Duke of Edinburgh died recently, but, you know, she has always been expecting that in an elderly husband. And so I think she was determined that she would make sure that her work carried on as quickly as possible. The ceremony has worked perfectly because it has delivered the principal moments of seeing the Crown and the monarch coming into Parliament, into the House of Lords, for the speech of the monarch written by, of course, the government of the day, has been delivered, which is therefore given a clear indication from the monarch as to what is to be done in this particular session at her instruction. And now it's down to all the representatives, both in the House of Commons and the peers in the House of Lords, to take it where they will. But I thought it was very touching that for the Queen, when her husband died as Duke of Edinburgh, his eldest son inherited. And so the Queen was escorted into the House of Lords by the Duke of Edinburgh.
Alistair, thank you very much indeed. Alistair, one of the heralds on this occasion, a dressed-down occasion. Her Majesty pretty spry getting up those steps to the throne today. Do stay with Sky News. Coming up, a briefing from Nicola Sturgeon about lifting of lockdown rules in Scotland. This is Sky News at 12 noon. Coming up, the Queen outlines the government's legislative agenda. Funding for training and an asylum overhaul are on the cards, but still no firm details on social care.
My government's priority is to deliver a national recovery from the pandemic that makes the United Kingdom stronger, healthier and more prosperous than before.
A coroner to publish her findings on the deaths of 10 civilians shot dead by British troops in Ballymurphy at the start of the Troubles. 9 children are among 26 people killed by Israeli airstrikes on Gaza as rockets are fired across the border into southern Israel. Facing questions, the billionaire financier Lex Greensill gives evidence to MPs over his influence on the government. Plus, a live audience returns to the Brit Awards for the first big live music event in more than a year. Well, good afternoon from Westminster. The Queen has just outlined the government's legislative agenda for the next year this lunchtime. The fixed-term Parliament, which means elections are held every 5 years, will be axed, giving the sitting government the ability to call a snap general election. Every adult will have access to a flexible loan for higher-level education and training. NHS patients will receive more tailored and preventative care closer to home. But there was no detail on social care, though Sky News understands proposals will be announced before the end of this calendar year.
My government's priority is to deliver a national recovery from the pandemic that makes the United Kingdom stronger, healthier and more prosperous than before. To achieve this, my government will level up opportunities across all parts of the United Kingdom, supporting jobs, businesses and economic growth, and addressing the impact of the pandemic on public services. My government will protect the health of the nation, continuing the vaccination programme and providing additional funding to support the NHS. My ministers will bring forward legislation to empower the NHS to innovate and embrace technology. Patients will receive more tailored and preventative care closer to home. Measures will be brought forward to support the health and well-being of the nation, including to tackle obesity and improve mental health. Proposals on social care reform will be brought forward.
Let's get some analysis on this programme for government from our political editor, Beth Rigby. Of course, Beth, they've got to get it all through Parliament, but they have got a majority. So what do they want to do to change the face of Britain?
Well, I think in the big picture of it, what you saw in that speech actually pointed back to what happened at the end of last week in terms of the local and the national elections. So there was talk of levelling up. That speaks to that Red Wall coalition, Boris Johnson's promises to try and improve the lives of people right across the UK, and particularly in those seats that backed him over Brexit, that voted for him in 2019, and then people again supporting the Conservatives, particularly in the North East and the West Midlands. So there's talk about levelling up, talk about skills. There's a bill in there about adult education and learning. There is stipulations that companies will provide more support. They'll be funded by government, but more company support for training. And then in terms of the union, he talked about strengthening the economic ties of the union, one eye clearly on Holyrood and Nicola Sturgeon's desire to hold a second independence referendum by the end of 2024. It will be an almighty battle between the UK government and the Scottish government. It might never happen in this Parliament, but there will be a battle. We talked about that at the weekend. So that's the kind of big thematically. And then in terms of, you know, what are the bills? I mean, social care is going to be discussed today. John Stevens, the deputy political editor from the Mail, just actually clipped up Boris Johnson, July 2019, just as he was elected Conservative leader, saying on the steps of Downing Street, I'm announcing now on the steps of Downing Street, we will fix the crisis in social care for all with a clear plan we have proposed. And, you know, we're now...
Still waiting.
We're still waiting. And Care England, the industry group, straight out the block saying that this is a missed opportunity. It's questionable how long the sector can be expected to limp on Again, proposals by the end of the year, but nothing on social
And
care.
abolishing the Fixed Term Parliament Act means there's now uncertainty as to whether the next general election will be in 2024 if they do it. Why? Why bother? I mean, it was introduced by David Cameron, a Conservative.
Well, it was introduced by David Cameron in a coalition government to sort of guarantee stability. Boris Johnson wants to have much more free rein over when he calls an election, and the suspicions is that actually what he might well do is call an election before 2024. At the moment, the election would be in 2024. Will he bring that forward by a year? Will he hold it in 2023? There was also some talk about whether he might adjust the length of time for elections. That's a Prime Ministerial power. Will he shorten the amount of time for campaigning as well? So tinkering around with elections may be to his advantage, which brings me back to the issue of voter ID. That will be very contentious, the requirement to take your passport, your driving licence, another form of ID, to the polling stations. The Electoral Commission in 2015 estimated that 3.5 million people do not have that sort of identification. And as I was saying earlier, there are only a few cases in 2019. So it is rather, as I was saying, a sledgehammer to crack a nut. And critics will think that it's very cynical and it's a way of disenfranchising some people.
Beth Ruby, thank you very much. Need more analysis from you throughout the day. Now, this was the first public engagement for Her Majesty the Queen since the death of her husband, Prince Philip. Let's bring in Sky's events commentator, Alistair Bruce. And Alistair, Her Majesty seemed to approach her duties in a very businesslike way.
Well, I expect she was fascinated and has much to talk about as a result of going into the House of Lords on her 67th opening and finding it nearly deserted. And it is almost extraordinary, I think, having been so regularly throughout history and seen it in a particular way. Certainly, probably much less smell of mothballs as a result of there being less people in there. But the ceremonial we saw today has basically followed precisely the structure and form that it always had. And that is the monarch arrives in, obviously not great splendour, but some splendour with the crown. And you get that sense that something very dramatic has arrived, and the monarch is very dramatic, the focus and head of state. And then you watch played out the ceremonial through the opening of the Parliament process, when you see the Commons coming from their chamber to the Queen, looking less splendid, less golden, less dramatic. And yet we know that our Constitution gives the concept of power to the Crown, and yet it is carried out by the representatives that constituencies return to Parliament. And they now have had the whistle blown on the start of the next part of the match by the Queen, and that political match, as Beth and you were discussing, will now take place, and it starts literally this afternoon. But the ceremonial and structure, whilst everybody was at a distance from one another and wearing whatever face masking was required, with the crown there, the Queen, supported on this occasion by the Prince of Wales, who, as I pointed out, rather interestingly, has inherited his father's title and so therefore delivered her to the throne with that title of Duke of Edinburgh. He is now the patriarch, and she is very much in the position that she's always held as head of state, delivering her duty.
So the Queen not wearing this year her royal regalia in a rather sort of fetching matching hat and day coat there. I think you describe it as lilac grey. Can we read anything into how she was dressed?
I don't think so. She tends to make decisions on the morning of the day. Lilac is one of the colours of, well, in that purple is one of the colours of mourning in the royal calendar, as it were. It's one of the tinctures with purple and mauve. So maybe there was a bit of that. But she tends to decide on what the weather's like and a practicality and what's available, and she runs with it. But never with any desire to, as it were, make that the issue. She was there to do the duty within the constraints that everyone in the United Kingdom and around the world, and particularly the Commonwealth, are facing. And, you know, she's seen wars. She's seen plenty come and go, and she can take all of it in her stride. And I think what's perfect is that the ceremonial she agreed with and gave approval to precisely marks our constitutional heartbeat in its start now of this new political term.
And I know you're very good on this. Sapphire brooches she's wearing. Any significance of those?
I can't remember exactly which ones they were, but they're lovely. They look like clip brooches, and she has plenty of them. And whilst I know all the principal ones that have a state story, like the Black Prince's ruby was in that crown, can you imagine, worn by Henry V at the Battle of Agincourt? And the little sapphire at the very top of the crown, beside her as she opened Parliament, was taken from the ring finger of Edward the Confessor when Henry III opened his tomb in Westminster Abbey in the 1200s.
Alistair, thank you. As ever, the most expert commentary from you. Thank you. Away from Westminster, a gunman has attacked a school in the Russian city of Kazan, killing 7 students and their teacher and injuring several others. Sky's Moscow correspondent Diana Magne joins us live with the latest. Diana.
There's a 19-year-old former student who went into his school just after 9 a.m. this morning, and this was the first day after a long 10-day May holiday break that the students had gone back, and he opened fire. Not sure if he targeted them specifically, but at children from the 8th grade, so mostly 14-year-olds. He had a pump-action, a Turkish-made pump-action hunting rifle, and there also seems to have been a large explosion that he set off in the school, because there is debris that you can see on a lot of the video, debris everywhere. The president of Tatarstan, and Kazan is the capital of the Tatarstan region, has toured the inside of the school. Huge devastation, really. He's crunching on broken glass everywhere. And as you say, 8 people dead, 7 children, 1 teacher. There's also been some rather disturbing video come out of the gunman who was detained by police and is now in a police station, tied down, basically railing about how he hates everybody, talking about how last summer he felt a monster come within him, that he felt that he was a god, and clearly he